Fundamentals of Cybersecurity, CSCI150N. This is your instructor, Peter Keurig, and welcome to Chapter 3, Operational and Organizational Security. In this chapter, you will learn to identify various operational aspects to security in your organization, identify various policies and procedures in your organization, identify the security awareness and training needs of an organization, understand the different types of agreements employed in negotiating security requirements, describe the physical security components that can protect your networks and computers, identify environmental factors that can affect security, identify factors that affect security of the growing number of wireless technologies used for data transmission, and prevent disclosure through electronic emissions. The outline for this video will look at policies and procedures, standards and guidelines, security awareness and training, interoperability agreements, the security perimeter, physical security, environmental issues, wireless and electromagnetic eavesdropping. An important part of any organization's approach to implementing security are the policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines that are established to detail what users and administrators should be doing to maintain the security of the systems and network. First, you must understand what each of these are. Policies are high-level, broad statements of what the organization wants to accomplish. They are made by management when laying out the organization's position on some issues. Procedures are the step-by-step instructions on how to implement policies in the organization. They describe exactly how the employees are expected to act in a given situation or to accomplish a specific task. Standards are mandatory elements regarding the implementation of a policy. They are accepted specifications that provide the specific details on how a policy is to be enforced. Some standards are externally driven. For example, they can be driven by membership in the payment card industry. If you accept credit cards, then you have to follow the PCI standards for credit card payment and the storage of the data for that payment. Then there's regulations. For banks and financial institutions, for example, require certain security measures to be taken by law. Other standards must be set by the organization to meet its own security goals. So, for example, if you are in a healthcare organization, such as health insurance, or you work for a hospital, you're required to follow HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. You're required to protect sensitive healthcare information for patients and their families. Guidelines are recommendations related to a policy. The key in this particular case is recommendations. Guidelines are not mandatory steps, so consider it advice. So the book talks a little bit about the policy life cycle, and there are 4 steps to this cycle that it goes continuously in a circle. First off, there's the planning step. This is where the management, senior management, data owner, and others that they feel that need to be involved in the planning process come together and help to design the policy. Preferably, you also get some user input on that design in order to ensure that the policies are realistic and do not prevent users from doing their work. Next, you want to implement. You want to train the users so they know what to expect with the policy, what their expectation or their piece is in that policy, and then actually enforce that policy. Next, you're going to monitor. Is the policy actually being followed? Are people doing what they're supposed to be doing with the policy? Fourth, evaluate. Is the policy being effective? Is it achieving the results that was expected in the planning process? If not, you want to go back through the planning process again with the appropriate personnel, then re-implement and monitor again. From a very general point of view, security policies are a high-level statement produced by senior management to outline both what security means to the organization and the organization's goal for security. The main security policy can then be broken down into additional policies that cover specific areas. Statements such as this organization will exercise the principles of least access in the handling of client information would be an example of a security policy. And to follow, you'll see some examples of other policies that might fall under that security policy. So the book looks at some different types of policies, one of them being the change management policy. Change management ensures proper procedures are followed when modifications to the IT infrastructure are made. These modifications can be prompted by a number of different events. This includes new legislation, updated versions of software or hardware, implementation of new software or hardware, or improvements to the infrastructure. The term management implies that this process should be controlled in some systematic way, and that is indeed the purpose. Without a process to manage these changes, an organization might suddenly find itself unable to conduct business due to some change or implementation that was not properly planned and implemented. The book also goes over data policies. As part of that, you should cover data ownership, unauthorized data sharing, data backups, the need to know disposal and destruction policies, data labeling, handling and disposal, and classification of information. Data ownership should cover who exactly owns what data within the organization and is responsible for it to be properly disposed. Unauthorized data sharing should discuss who and what data can be shared and what happens if it is improperly shared. Data backups, when are data backups done, what data is backed up when, and the frequency of it. The need to know who has the right to see and know certain information and how it's restricted. Disposal and destruction policy. How do you get rid of the data when you no longer need it, to ensure that that data is not exposed to people who do not have a need to know. Finally, data labeling, handling, and disposal, in the sense of, for example, reports, especially if they've been printed out, or information from a database that's been printed out. How should it be properly handled and labeled and disposed of when no longer needed? And that kind of falls in line with the last one there, classification of information. So how you handle things will depend on the classification of the information. The book gives kind of two parallel examples. One is the U.S. government's means of classification, which is to look at data as being unclassified, sensitive but unclassified, otherwise known as for official use only, confidential, secret, and top secret. And then in the business world, now of course if you're a government contractor, you might use some of the same government classifications. But typically in the business world, they have their own within the business that falls somewhere around public releasable, proprietary, company confidential, for internal use only. And it might also have protected private information based upon laws such as human resource database, or you might have medical information that's protected and classified because medical is protected by HIPAA. So there are other classifications that the book doesn't necessarily mention. So human resource policies can have an effect on security, and some of the policies that you can look at from a human resource perspective are code of ethics, job rotation, employee hiring and promotion, retirement, separation or termination of employees, mandatory vacations, onboarding and offboarding of business partners, social media, acceptable use policies, internet usage, email usage, clean desk policies, bringing your own devices, and privacy policies. So typically code of ethics fall under the profession of the employee. So for example, doctors, or in my case, because my certifications in CISM and CISSP, both organizations that sponsor those certifications have a code of ethics that I agree to, and if I violate them and I am found guilty of a violation of them, I can have my certificate terminated, and I could also be barred from recertification. Job rotation. This means that that you create a policy that somebody has to change jobs every so often, so they're not in the same job for years at a time. So for example, if they're in a risky position that has access to high fund accounts without a lot of eyes on it, if you do a job rotation, they move out and somebody else move in, and either the person who comes in sees that there was a problem, or if there was certain activity that ceased upon that person being moved, that would indicate that there was previously a problem, and that might have been the person involved with it. Employee hiring and promotion. When you hire new employees, hopefully your organization, especially if they're in a sensitive position, is doing background checks and properly promoting people into positions based upon their eligibility due to background checks, security checks, and skills. Retirement and separation or termination of an employee. How do you go about doing that? If somebody's obviously hiring, they're leaving on pretty good grounds. Do you wait to terminate their network access until the day that they leave, or do you do it a week before? And then usually when it comes to somebody who is being terminated because they've done something wrong, you don't indicate to them that you're terminating them until you've already cut off their network access so they can't do anything wrong. Either A, delete evidence of things that they might have been doing, or B, destroy valuable data as a means of retribution for the termination. Mandatory vacations is another way, kind of like job rotation, to detect wrongdoing by having somebody leave if there's a significant change in the baseline activity on your network, or how data is being processed, or if you get an opportunity during these mandatory vacations to do some auditing, you might detect some wrongdoing, be it intentional or accidental. The onboarding and offboarding business partner is kind of like when you're hiring and firing employees. You want to make sure whoever you're bringing on board as a business partner has been properly vetted. And when they leave, you need to make sure that the rights and access that they have to your network through whatever extranets or whatever is properly terminated. Social media networks, you want to have some kind of policy in place for your employees. It could be as simple as you tell them that they are not to mention that they are employees of your organization on social media. But other organizations like mine, the Army, or the military as a whole, has social media policies because when people go out there and they do something in uniform, let's say military uniform, or let's say you're a police officer, or let's say you're even McDonald's, and you go do something really stupid in a uniform, you draw attention to that organization as well as you yourself with the personal behavior that you conducted. So, for example, on Facebook, you can actually do a search and find military social media idiots, where there was a bunch of people who have posted some really stupid photos of them in military uniform, or discussing things in social media about their military service that have caused an embarrassment. And that can be not just the military, but any organization as a whole. Acceptable use, internet usage, and email usage are all kind of the same thing. Basically, the organization outlines what they allow and what they don't allow on their networks, what they consider acceptable. Maybe you don't want people going to social media, and you could put that in there under acceptable in internet usage. Things like pornography, harassment, hate groups, those are other things you want to include in the acceptable use policy. Clean desk policy, you want to have a policy that basically enforces that people don't have their work papers, notes, passwords, billing information, things of that sort laying out on their desk when they leave at the end of the day, or even when they just get up and walk away from their desk. If it's sensitive enough, it should probably be locked up in a drawer or a cabinet whenever it's unattended. Bring your own device policies have come into play now that some organizations, in order to reduce costs, are allowing employees to bring their own laptops or their own phones and add them to the network. So the bring your own device policy might indicate how those devices should be configured and protected in order for them to be allowed onto the network. And privacy policies. This could be driven by legislation, by profession, or just how the company views privacy as a whole. So depending on the particular industry that you're in, that'll drive your privacy policy. So some students get a little tricked up on the due care versus due diligence. Due care generally refers to the standard of care a reasonable person is expected to exercise in all situations, and due diligence generally refers to the standard of care a business is expected to exercise in preparation for a business transaction. The concept of due care and due diligence are both connected. Due care addresses whether the organization has a minimum set of policies that provides reasonable assurances of success in maintaining security, and due diligence requires that the management actually exercises those policies in such a way as to implement procedures for testing and review, auditing records, internal security controls, and personal behavior to ensure that security is maintained. The book also discusses due process. It's concerned with guaranteeing fundamental fairness, justice, and liberty in relation to an individual's legal rights. In the United States, due process is concerned with the guarantee of an individual's right outlined by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Procedural due process is based upon the concept of what is fair. Also of interest is the recognition by courts of a series of rights that are not explicitly specific by the Constitution, but the courts have decided are implicit in the concepts embodied in the Constitution. An example of this is an individual right to privacy. From an organization's point of view, due process may come into play during an administrative action that adversely affects an employee. Before an employee is terminated, for example, were all the employee's rights protected. No matter how careful an organization is, eventually a security incident of some sort will occur. When it happens, how effectively the organization responds to it will depend greatly on how prepared it is to handle incidents. An incident response policy and associated procedures should be developed to outline how the organization will prepare for security incidents and respond to them when they occur. The incident response policy should cover 5 phases: preparation, detection, containment and eradication, recovery, and follow-up actions. In my organization, we have both an incident response policy and an incident response procedure. This allows the incident responders, regardless of who they are, to meet the organization's needs. It was put together by a team consisting of data owners, users, as well as the IT and security staff within the organization. The security awareness and training programs provided by an organization can support the security posture in two different ways. There are many tasks that employees perform that can have information security ramifications. Properly trained employees are able to perform their duties in a manner that's effective and includes their duties associated with information security. The extent of information security training will vary depending on the organization's environment and the level of threat, but initial employee security training at the time of being hired is important, as is periodic refresher training. A strong security education and awareness training program can go a long way towards reducing the chance that a social engineering attack will be successful. So, for example, in my organization, all new hires have to attend a 2 to 3 hour in-person training on security awareness. Now, this includes discussion of network policies and procedures, the different tools that are available on the network to them, as well as we go over how to protect their home systems. Because in reality, when people have access to email at home, you're opening up a gateway to your organization for any malicious files or behavior to come in through. And then in the military, folks are also required to do annual training, refresher training on information assurance online as a requirement for maintaining their network access. On the previous slide, we stated that organizations' security posture can be enhanced in 2 direct ways through user training. First, security policy training and procedures. Personnel cannot be expected to perform complex tasks without being trained with respect to the tasks and expectations. This applies to both the security policy and the operational security details. So if employees are going to be expected to comply with the organization's security policy, they must be properly trained in its purpose, its meaning, and its objectives. Training with respect to the information security policy and individual responsibilities and expectations is something that it requires periodic reinforcement through refresher training. Because the security policy is a high-level directive that sets the overall support and executive direction with respect to security, it is important that the meaning of this message be translated and supported. It should be a top-down approach from your executive management down. Second-level policies such as password access, information handling, and acceptability use policies also need to be covered in the training. The collection of policies should paint a picture describing the desired security culture of the organization. The second way that security training can directly affect organization security posture is through role-based training. So the previous slide we discussed training that was for all general users, and I stated that with new hires in my organization, we required that everybody go through that 2 to 3 hour class. But then there's also role-based training. So people who have specific access or specific job duties should go through training specific to their roles and how to keep the information properly protected and secured, and what their job is to help bolster that. There are a great number of laws, regulations, contractual requirements, standards, and best practices associated with information security. For example, PCI, payment card industry, requires any organization who takes credit card payments to meet certain standards for storing and transporting or transferring information. Regulations such as HIPAA require that medical information is properly secured in certain ways. And then there's contracts that may be between two different firms on how they handle data and store data and access that data. Best practices can be translated into things like the SANS Top 20 or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. But each places its own set of requirements upon an organization and its personnel. The only effective way for an organization to address these requirements is to build them into their own policies and procedures. It is important to note that many of these external requirements impart a specific training and awareness component on them. Organizations are subject to these requirements under various legislation and standards and contractual requirements. Individual user responsibilities vary between organizations and the type of business each organization is involved in, but there are certain very basic responsibilities that all users should be instructed to adopt. For example, lock the door to your office or workspace, including drawers and cabinets. You should never have sensitive information out on your desktop when it's unattended. Do not leave sensitive information, or better yet, your computer and cell phone with any sensitive information on it in your car unprotected. For example, I tell my classes that first thing you do when you leave work is you put the laptop in your trunk, because if you're putting it into your trunk when you get to the store that you stop to get gas for or pick up some groceries, you're too late. You're doing it in the parking lot and somebody's seeing you do it. Secure storage media containing sensitive information is secured storage devices. Shred papers. Do divulge sensitive information to individuals who are not authorized to hear that information. Do not discuss sensitive information with family members. Protect laptops and other mobile devices that contain sensitive information. I kind of mentioned that with the car. Be aware of who is around you when discussing sensitive information. Does everyone within earshot need to hear? Enforce corporate access control policies. Be alert to, but don't allow and do not allow piggybacking and shoulder surfing or access without proper credentials. Be aware of the correct procedures to report suspicious or actual violations of security policy, and follow procedures established to enforce good password security. Bottom line, user habits are the frontline security tool in engaging the workforce to improve the overall security posture of an organization. Security training should also be updated on a fairly regular basis, because there's always new threats and security trends that are happening. So new viruses or botnets or malware that's out there, phishing attacks. So you want to talk about specific ones that are trending at the time. For more important users, you want to talk about things like whaling, whale phishing, and spear phishing attacks. And then social networking and peer-to-peer, you want to discuss trends in that as well. You want to also track training metrics and compliance. So, for example, with my classes that I teach for new users, there's a sign-in roster that allows us to keep track of who attended and keep track of their annual training requirements. Many businesses operations involve actions between many different parties, some within an organization and some in different organizations. These actions require communications between the parties, defining the responsibilities and the expectations of the parties, the business objectives, and the environment within which the objectives will be pursued. To ensure an agreement is understood between the parties, usually a written agreement is used. So, for example, a service level agreement. There are contract agreements between entities that describe specific levels of service that the service entity agrees to guarantee to the customer. Then the business partnership agreement is a legal agreement between partners establishing the terms and conditions and expectations of the relationship that's between the two of them. Memorandums of understanding. This is usually a bilateral agreement or legal document between two parties. It's written to express a set of intended actions between the parties with respect to some common pursuit or goal. For example, maybe two different organizations agree to use each other as their continuity of operations or backup operations locations in the event of emergency. And then interconnection security agreements. It's a special agreement between organizations that have interconnected IT systems. The purpose of which is to document the security requirements associated with the interconnection. This chapter's discussion on security perimeter is very limited. The important thing to take away from this section is that sometimes when you think you only have one or two exit and entrance points into your network, there might be a little bit more. So the original diagram gives you just the router coming into the network, and the book talks about how the administrator might only be aware of that one, but there could be other points of entry into the network, such as wireless access points, modems, PBXs, and things of that sort, that they may not necessarily be aware of. So this actually comes around to the NIST, where the first functional area, identify, covers asset management, which means you should know what's connected to your network and where your entry and exit points are on your network. So make sure you are tracking all the assets. Now let's look at physical security. It consists of all mechanisms used to ensure that the physical access to the computer systems and network is restricted to only authorized users. Additional physical security mechanisms may be used to provide increased security for especially sensitive systems such as servers and devices such as routers, firewalls, and intrusion detection systems. So for example, routers and switches that may be branch offices might be in a locked room or closet as opposed to out on a shelf or in a rack that's easily accessible to people. Questions that should be addressed is there a false ceiling with tiles that can be easily removed? So for example, if you have a data center and you're looking up and you see ceiling tiles, if you lift those tiles, can you see over the wall that's next to it, or do the walls go all the way up and down? Because it kind of defeats the purpose to have a sophisticated lock on your data center door if someone can come up through the ceiling tiles. Is there a raised floor? And likewise, is there a gap that exits the perimeter of the room that somebody can come in through under the floor, or some kind of ventilation shaft or a duct that would allow somebody to come in? Do the walls extend all the way down to the actual floor? How are important systems situated within your data center? Are they where you can see them from a window? From outside, where somebody could see sensitive information if somebody was working on the servers? Or is it near a window or a camera where you can monitor people who are in there doing their work as well? Who has access to the facility? Type of access controls that are there? Is it swipe card, PIN, things of that sort? Who is allowed unsupervised access in the facility? Is there an alarm system or security camera to cover the area? And what procedures govern the monitoring of the alarm system and security cameras to detect unauthorized activities? When addressing physical security, we have physical access controls and physical barriers. Physical access controls can be combination locks, cipher locks, keys, badge readers, and biometrics. Now, combination and cipher locks, the issue is that the code or the combination needs to be changed when people are relieved of a position, when new people come on, and we needs to be done on a periodic basis to ensure that the combination has been given to people who shouldn't have it. Key locks, they're much easier to restrict because you can have a certain number of keys, especially if you can restrict the duplication of those keys. The downside is if keys are lost, you either have to replace them and or change the locks to ensure that if the keys are falling in the wrong hands, that somebody unauthorized doesn't get into the area. Badge readers are really good, but they cost more money. But they do, it allows you not only to restrict to individuals, but also record and hold them accountable for their access to restricted space. And biometrics, even though they're getting better, they're still not 100%. You can have misreads with readers that either prevent you from coming in with false negatives, or you can have false positives where somebody unauthorized gets access because the biometrics somehow are more closely related to the person they're trying to mimic getting in. Physical barriers can be things such as fences and walls, and even open spaces. If you ever get a chance, take a look at a photo of prisons and military forts. You'll see that just outside their actual perimeter fence, they have a clearing of space around. This allows them to have observation of people approaching their perimeter, which offers additional security. Signs can be considered a physical barrier because they can also be a deterrent, and you put them up in order to deter people from trying to penetrate that perimeter. Man traps are a space that's designed with two doors. In order to be able to access an area, you have to pass through one with it closing behind you before the next one can open. Concrete barriers are used to prevent vehicles or whatever from accessing a restricted space. You see them sometimes as planters in front of sensitive buildings, things of that sort. Environmental issues include things such as heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, electrical power, humidity, and heat and environments of nature. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning are essential for maintaining proper temperature in order for the servers or data center to properly operate and not overheat. But it's also, if you take a look at the target hack, an entry point through the automated HVAC systems for somebody to break into your systems if they're integrated onto your primary network. Electrical power is crucial for a data center to operate. Therefore, you can't just rely on a power grid because the storms or other natural disasters could cause power to be knocked out. So you need to have, first off, in order to keep surges or fluctuation in the power from taking out your data center, you need to have uninterrupted power supplies, which are basically giant banks of batteries that keeps the voltage at a constant level regardless of the fluctuation in the power. And usually these UPSs can run your data center for like a 10 to 15 minute period. So if there is a prolonged power outage, the next level of power should be from a generator, which you should be able to kick in within a 10 to 15 minute period. If not, you should initiate a shutdown of your data center to prevent the loss of any critical data in things such as transaction databases and things of that sort. Humidity and heat kind of comes back to that HVAC. You want to make sure that the humidity level as well as the temperature is maintained at a level that is not destructive to your equipment. And then environments of nature, well, that has to do with, for example, if you are setting up your data center in the basement of a building in a flood zone, well, you're running the risk of your data center being flooded out. So you want to be aware of the environment that you're around. If you're on a floodplain, you want your data center to be much higher. If you're in a earthquake zone, you don't want your data center to be on the 60th floor of a skyscraper. Things of that sort. So you want to properly plan based upon the expected environment that you're in. For most of you, these wireless technologies should be pretty familiar with. You should be pretty familiar with by now. Wireless networks based on the 802.11 IEEE standard are your typical wireless that you find in your homes. BGN networks, your Bluetooth, your different handheld devices, and the accessories that go with them is meant to be a personal area network that only has a few, like maybe a 10-foot range. Wireless devices such as keyboards, mice, cameras, pointers, things of that sort, and cell phones. Each one of these have their inherent issues with them. For example, wireless devices such as keyboard, mouse, and cameras, somebody could either interfere with by getting on the same frequency with a similar device and pretending to be the device you're using, or they could intercept keystrokes, for example, to gain passwords, things of that sort. Cell phones, in the older days when they were analog, people could listen in on conversations. It's a lot harder to do today because the technology that's being used, especially the more the spread spectrum stuff that's going on. But nonetheless, there's always the possibility that somebody can listen on that. It's more like to be done on the network end of it than it is to be done on the actual catching it on the wireless side, though. Wireless networks, the WEP security protocol has been cracked already, and then the WPA is the current one that is the recommended security setting. The final section of this chapter is electronic eavesdropping. Kind of goes with the last thing we were talking about with the wireless, but as far as eavesdropping goes, it's some of the things to be concerned about is listening in or interception of signals. It's getting harder and harder with the more digitized and encrypted wireless that's out there, but they can still be sniffing for wireless packets and listening in on any analog conversations or single channel digital communications. There's also something the book touches on, which is called Tempest. I'm going to have a video link in this week's assignments for you to watch a little bit of some Tempest stuff going on. It's really interesting because with the experiments that were done with it, they could read monitors through walls. If you have two network cables that were close enough together, you could get the radio emissions generated from the electrical signals crossing one wire to be picked up on the next. And this all, if you ever work in a secure environment, becomes a requirement that you mitigate some of these. And there's various ways to do it. We're not going to get into too much detail with it. Some of it's just simply because some of it is actually protected information. But just understand it exists. It has to do with monitoring and countering the monitoring of electronic emissions from electronic devices. I'm your instructor, Peter Keurig, for Nashville Community College. Thank you for watching.